The sky above New Dakar was the same dull gray it had been for generations. Not from clouds or weather systems. Those had long since been regulated and taxed, but from the ever-churning orbital platforms of the Zar'Kun, casting endless shadow across the world that once dared to call itself the cradle of civilization. Alya stood in the mineral dust of the red zone, her rebreather filtering the metallic sting from her lungs. Around her, humans moved like ants, hunched under the burden of labor that had become their inheritance. The clanging of excavator arms and the bark of Zar'Kun overseers echoed through the half-collapsed mining corridor. The Sovereignty had named Earth Resource Node Theta 6. Most didn't even call it Earth anymore. But Alya remembered. She had been raised on whispers, stories from her grandmother, smuggled history files encoded into lullabies, fragments of languages no longer spoken aloud. Words like freedom, democracy, and home. Forbidden concepts carefully hidden behind the mask of servitor obedience. Today, she smiled behind her mask as she passed the checkpoint. She'd been promoted last cycle, from tunnel engineer to logistics coordinator. Still a servitor, of course. Still owned, by technicality, by the Zar'Kun House of Zekril. But in her new role, she had access. Schedules, transport manifests, supply chains, names, information. She passed beneath the steel ribs of the ancient industrial dome and entered the control shack, just a glorified prefab container welded to an old Terran building's ruins. Inside, the lights buzzed, flickering between brightness levels as the systems adjusted to her human biology. A biometric lens scanned her iris, confirmed her designation, Servitor Unit ALY, 1289, and unlocked the terminal. She typed swiftly, feeding data into the Sovereignty's logistics core. On the surface, it looked like standard processing, or counts, workforce distribution, maintenance forecasts. But tucked inside the metadata, woven with precision, were tiny anomalies. A shipment marked for inter-colony export was rerouted to an unlisted lunar relay. A crew roster was adjusted so that 2 resistance contacts could meet face-to-face. Just numbers on a screen. To the Zar'Kun, humans were inferior, uncreative, dull. They never imagined their tools could rebel in silence. A beep. A coded message from another servitor unit on Enceladus. Plant secured. Will begin water reroute in 3 rotations. Alya allowed herself the briefest flicker of satisfaction. The mission was working. Piece by piece, across planets and moons, humans were weaving a web. Not of war, but of quiet power. The door hissed open behind her. She turned, carefully neutral in expression. A massive figure loomed. 7 feet of sinew, plated armor, and regal indifference. Overseer Zar'Kun of House Zekril. His 4 crimson eyes scanned the room without expression, though his upper hands rested near his shock staff. "You are ALY 1289, he said, his voice like gravel under pressure. "Yes, Overseer. You have been efficient. Clean logs. Predictive models show 17% decrease in equipment failure since your assignment." "Thank you, Overseer." He stared at her for a moment longer, then turned and left, his claws clicking against the floor. She exhaled slowly. Another test. They'd started sending inorganic inspectors lately. The machines were too easily fooled. The Zar'Kun might be arrogant, but they weren't entirely stupid. They suspected something, somewhere. But they would look for saboteurs, bombers, revolutionaries, not a logistics clerk with perfect metrics. Later that evening, in the barracks, Alya sat cross-legged on a rust-stained cot. Around her, the others murmured, cleaned tools, or dozed beneath the flickering ceiling lights. She opened her meal packet, the nutrient paste as tasteless as always. Her roommate, Tins, slid onto the cot beside her, handing over a small datapad wrapped in fabric. Message came in from Titan. He whispered, "Council want confirmation on next phase." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she handed him half her meal packet. To the Watchers, it looked like 2 tired laborers sharing food. In truth, she was conveying acceptance. 2 bites, proceed. 1 bite, delay. He ate both halves. The next phase would begin soon. In orbit, aboard the old Zar'Kun freighter Vekratha, another human agent walked among the cargo bays. Dressed in the blue-gray uniform of a freighter crewman, he was indistinguishable from the others. But on his wrist was a cuff with access to comms the Sovereignty believed restricted to elite crew. He opened a link, just static on the outside. Inside, he spoke. Network node Alpha reporting. Earth is ready. There was no door. Not a real one, at least. The entrance to the Shadow Bureau on New Carthage Prime was hidden behind the facade of a waste reclamation facility, one of the countless systems in the Zar'Kun megacities that processed the refuse of 1,000 species. It reeked of ammonia, burnt metal, and industrial grease. The perfect place for people no one wanted to notice. Darren Becky passed through the odor without flinching. He long since stopped noticing it. He walked with the gait of a servitor, purposeful but subservient, confident only in his usefulness. He wore the gray and orange overalls of a sanitation tech, his ID chip properly embedded just beneath his wrist. The Zar'Kun scanners pinged him in passing and moved on. Beneath that uniform, Darren was one of the most dangerous men alive. Inside the main ducting corridor, he turned a valve 3 clicks clockwise, then 1 counter. The wall hissed. A hidden seam split open, and a section of the pipe lifted like a trapdoor. He stepped into darkness and descended the narrow shaft. Lights flickered on as he moved deeper. They weren't Zar'Kun fluorescents. They were Terran-made, old, low energy, flickering like candles. Human light. At the bottom, the Bureau unfolded. Dozens of humans sat in a cavernous space made from hollowed-out sublevels, deep in the bowels of the city. Makeshift desks, repurposed consoles, piles of Zar'Kun comm tablets reprogrammed with Earth languages and encryption. Maps, charts, and data streams lined the walls, supply routes, troop movements, political shifts. Surveillance footage captured by hundreds of invisible eyes across the Sovereignty. At the center of it all stood Kaylin Reese, director of the Shadow Bureau. She didn't look like a leader. She wasn't old or grizzled or particularly tall. She wore the same uniform as the others, though her left eye was cybernetic, gold and polished. It clicked softly as she turned to greet Darren. "You're late," she said without looking up from her screen. "I stopped to grab a fusion core from Bay 8. That'll get your East Terminal running again." Kaylin raised an eyebrow. "You bring me power cells and sarcasm. Be still, my heart." Darren grinned and dropped the small device on her desk. "I also bring news. From Tannic Station. One of ours just got promoted to assistant envoy for House Ralzeth." Kaylin froze. "You're serious?" she asked. Darren nodded. "Says he was recommended by his superior, some Krail diplomat he's been feeding cultural insights to. They think he's a savant in nonverbal negotiations. He's basically been manipulating body language patterns." Kaylin leaned back, exhaling. "That makes 6 operatives in subdiplomatic positions. If we can get even one into the Imperial Court." Darren lowered his voice. "We'll rewrite the rules without ever firing a shot." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "Good. Phase 2 is holding. Let's keep the momentum." Elsewhere in the Bureau's labyrinth, a trio of analysts worked through intercepted Zar'Kun transmissions. Most were mundane. Inventory reports, planetary schedules, the dull hum of Empire maintenance. But every so often, a gem emerged. "Here," one analyst tapped the screen. "Routine patrol reports unusual diplomatic tension between Houses Kraz and Fundur. Something about contested trade lanes and honor duels. That's the 3rd incident this cycle," another muttered. "They're unraveling faster than expected. Should we intervene?" The lead analyst shook her head. "Not yet. Let them tear each other apart. Then we offer the survivors something better." At the far edge of the compound, beneath a flickering blue light, sat Janal Tor. She had once been a linguist before the conquest, fluent in 9 Terran dialects and 2 pre-Zar'Kun alien trade tongues. Now, she was the Bureau's top forger and communications expert. She sipped bitter tea and ran her fingers across a keyboard. Her current project, crafting an internal memo from a mid-ranking Zar'Kun logistics officer to a noble on Chursak. 9, hinting at corruption within their own ranks. The noble would investigate. He would find exactly what she wanted him to find. The key to the Bureau's success wasn't brute force. It was understanding the Zar'Kun mindset, pride, paranoia, protocol. Give them a little doubt, and they'd consume each other with it. They were predators who believed they ruled through strength. The Bureau knew better. They ruled through perception. Back in the central hub, Kalen pulled up the masterboard. It displayed the sovereignty's hierarchy. The emperor, the great houses, the governors, the enforcers, the advisors. Names glowed in red, yellow, and green, targets, risks, allies. She tapped the red icon labeled House Zekril. We need them unstable before the next summit. They've been growing too comfortable. Suggestions? Darren studied the board. Their viceroy on Edon. 3, just married in a house, fell in AR. That's politically fragile. Ancient rivalry. We push rumors of betrayal. Leak a fabricated affair with a human consort. Maybe forge a military redeployment order to make it look like a coup. Kalen smiled. Make it so. The Bureau didn't look like a rebellion. It wasn't loud. It wasn't heroic. But it was patient. It was precise. And it was winning. Across the sovereignty, humans were no longer just miners, janitors, cannon fodder. They were scribes, whisperers, advisors. And some, like the one who had just been promoted on Tannic Station, were only one breath away from the throne room itself. Kalen looked across her people, her mind sharpening around one undeniable truth. The Zar'Kun had conquered Earth, but they had let humanity inside, and that was their greatest mistake. The capital world of the Zar'Kun Sovereignty, Isharakel, was a temple of discipline and dominion. Its towering blackstone spires pierced the stratosphere, choked in crimson light from a dying sun. The city, if it could be called such, was carved like a blade, efficient, beautiful, merciless. Here, everything had a place. Every caste, every species, every breath. The sovereignty's core laws were etched into the walls of the Imperial Forum in 100 languages, none of them human. And yet, within these sacred halls of power, a soft-spoken Terran tactician now whispered poison into the right ears. Alric Voss bowed low before the council dais, his back bent in ritual subservience. The Zar'Kun nobles gathered before him paid him little mind. Just another servitor advisor, useful but replaceable. A tool, not a threat, which was exactly how he wanted it. Lord General Varul of House Fundur paced slowly across the chamber, his obsidian armor gleaming with ceremonial etchings. His 4 arms were folded in agitation, claws tapping against his side. The others watched him, silent. They insulted us. Varul growled, his voice a low thunder. House Kraz violates our trade compact and dares blame us for the breach. Our warships held the line. We honored the accord. And now they petition the Emperor for sanctions against Fundur. Perhaps, Alric said softly, they believe weakness lies in overreaction. Varul turned to him, baring his fangs. Speak, servitor. Clearly. Alric straightened, but only slightly. He kept his tone deferential, but firm. My lord, it is well known that House Kraz's new advisor hails from the Imodalari School of Economic Maneuvering. They excel at provocation without blame. It is possible, even likely, that this breach was engineered to appear as your failure in order to create a pattern of incompetence over time. Several nobles murmured. Varul frowned. You suggest they're playing a long game? Alric inclined his head. I only observe patterns, my lord, and advise caution. If retaliation is desired, perhaps it should come through more oblique channels. Varul grunted and turned away, but he did not object further. That was enough. Outside the council chamber, Alric walked slowly through the obsidian corridors of Isharakel, accompanied by a silent shadow, Tari, a Moran operative disguised as a fellow servitor. She blended into the role effortlessly, her eyes constantly scanning. When they were alone in one of the purification chambers, she spoke. You've planted the doubt. Alric nodded. Varul will begin internal audits. He'll suspect betrayal from within. I've already sent a forged communique implicating one of Kraz's minor house members in bribery. Tari smirked. You'll have them at each other's throats by next cycle. I'm counting on it. Back on Enceladus, Alya reviewed the fallout. The Bureau's shadow network had spread rapidly, mostly through data laundering and cultural manipulation. The Zar'Kun might have superior weapons, but they treated language, psychology, and diplomacy as tools too subtle to matter, which made them blind. "Play the clip again," she said. On screen, an intercepted conversation unfolded between two noble aides, one from House Fendur, the other from Kraz. Both expressed concern over the manipulation of truth by external elements, blaming each other, but unaware they were quoting lines from a false document seeded by Bureau agents. "Implanted dissonance is stable," her analyst said. "They're starting to mistrust even their own logs." "Good," Alya replied. "Now feed them the real bait." The bait was a data packet that appeared to be a covert surveillance file, supposedly recovered by Fendur's internal security. It detailed a falsified scheme by House Kraz to collude with a Banvokari cult. Total fabrication, but believable enough, close enough to the truth to be dangerous. The Zar'Kun had always prided themselves on order. But now, every ripple bred more ripples. Every shadow grew darker. Meanwhile, on the jungle moon of Varela 9, a human medic named Eshar Rin treated wounded soldiers of 3 different species: Zar'Kun, Vreli, and human. The Sovereignty's war machine depended on these cross-species outposts, where fresh troops were trained and conditioned for planetary pacification. But Eshar wasn't there to heal. He was there to listen. The Vreli were beginning to question the campaign. Why were their people dying in greater numbers than the Zar'Kun? Why were their medics supplied second? Why were humans, despite their low rank, more often placed in advisory roles near command? Eshar never answered these questions. He simply listened, and when he left, he shared everything with the Bureau. 3 weeks later, a Vreli field marshal issued a formal complaint against his superior. A week after that, a Vreli cruiser broke formation in the midst of a border skirmish, claiming miscommunication. It wasn't sabotage. It was seeds, watered slowly. In the depths of the Bureau's archive chamber, Kalen Reese traced a long red line across a star map. Connected points lit up: military staging grounds, diplomatic nodes, key relay hubs. Each one was a potential fracture point. She turned to Janal, who was tuning a subspace frequency jammer. "We need another wave of instability. Something to keep their attention on each other." Janal didn't look up. "There's a minor trade guild under House Molken. They've been smuggling luxury tech to House Ralzeth without proper authorization. One leak, and it'll spark a full customs scandal." Kayla nodded. "Leak it through House Torvin's envoy. Make it look like they're cleaning house. A dozen steps ahead. Always." Later that cycle, Kalen stood before her senior operatives. Alya, Alric, Darren, Tari, Janal. They were tired, thin, worn by years of playing the invisible game. But they were winning. "They still don't suspect us," she said. "They think their collapse is coming from within." "It is," Alric replied. "We've just helped them look in the wrong direction." Kalen allowed herself the rarest of indulgences: a smile. The backwater moon of Lyrian 7 was not supposed to host meetings of great importance. Its surface was covered in nothing but cracked, barren earth and dead craters. The atmosphere was too thin, the gravity too weak. Few bothered to set foot there unless it was for something no one else could trace. But that was precisely why it had been chosen. The underground chambers of Lyrian 7's outpost were a maze of rusting metal, dark corridors, and cold steel. It looked like the remains of some long-forgotten war, abandoned after a 1,000-year-old conflict. If you didn't know better, you would have thought it was the last place anyone would choose to meet for anything important. Inside, the clandestine assembly had already begun. Alya stepped into the cavernous hall, where representatives from several alien factions were gathered, each one distinct in its appearance and bearing. Tall Vreli warlords stood side by side with short, wiry Kareth negotiators, while sleek Nixel traders lounged on low seats, watching everyone with a detached, almost alien curiosity. At the far end of the room stood Kalen Reese, flanked by Auric Voss, Darren Becky, and a few trusted Bureau agents. She was speaking with Corian, the leader of the Kareth faction. Despite the faint tension in the air, she wore a smile, her calm demeanor a perfect mask for the whirlwind of thoughts spinning behind her eyes. When Alia entered, Kaelin's gaze briefly flicked toward her, just a momentary flicker of recognition, before the conversation resumed. The deal was in its final stages. Alia moved to stand beside Auric, her mind still processing everything that had led to this point. There had been months of groundwork, data exchanges, subtle political favors, the careful placement of trusted agents within the most powerful factions in the galaxy. Now, at the heart of the Zar'Kun Empire, the greatest covert operation ever conceived was nearing completion. "Are they buying it?" Alia asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the others. Auric's lips twitched in a small smile. "They have to. Our offer's too good to resist." At that, Kaelin's voice cut through the low hum of conversation. "Everyone, if I may." The room quieted as Kaelin took her place at the central podium, her voice steady and clear. "We have been discussing the future. The future not of your individual houses, but of the galaxy we all share. For too long, the Zar'Kun have reigned unchecked, dictating terms and subjugating weaker species to their will. It's time for something new. It's time to build a new order, one that is just, one that is shared." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room, locking with each of the delegates. There was no turning back now. They had come too far to stop. We, as humans, know the pain of oppression better than most, but we also know the power of unity. We've reached out to you because you understand this as well. And now, we ask for your support. We seek to dethrone the Zar'Kun, to reshape the Empire, not through bloodshed, but through intelligence, strategy, and cooperation. There was a beat of silence. The weight of her words hung heavy in the room. Tari, a quiet but formidable Moran operative, moved to the front and stood beside Kaelin. With a single glance, she confirmed the final step had been initiated. The factions had been swayed. Auric leaned in toward Alia. "This is it. We've drawn them in. If they back us, we control the balance. If they don't, we have the leverage to keep them divided." Alia nodded, but the weight of the moment was heavy on her shoulders. The plan had been years in the making. It had begun with quiet infiltration, with stealing away the smallest bits of power, with influence, not force. The key was always to remain unnoticed, to never tip the scales too soon. But now, with the help of a dozen alien factions that had long been oppressed by the Zar'Kun, their moment had arrived. Kaelin continued, her tone still smooth, confident. "We will not take the throne by force. We do not seek war. What we offer is simple, a new council, one where all voices are heard. Humans, Vreli, Kareth, Nixel, and all those who have suffered under the weight of Zar'Kun imperialism. Together, we will rewrite the rules of this galaxy." Another silence followed. Alia felt the tension in the room escalate. Some factions exchanged cautious glances, their representatives unsure of what to make of this ambitious proposal. Others looked intrigued, leaning forward slightly. The Kareth were particularly receptive, their long eyes glinting with the promise of a chance to finally assert their influence. The Vreli seemed less certain, but they would be swayed by the promise of power, just as their species always had been. And then, as if on cue, a low, vibrating hum echoed through the room, signaling the arrival of a delegation from House Zar'Kun. Alia's heart skipped. She knew the house's reputation. They were formidable. They were one of the Zar'Kun's most powerful families, and their support of the human cause would be both a triumph and a major risk. The Zar'Kun delegates entered the hall with a flourish. Tall, with deep crimson scales and armored in their house's signature black and red plating, they swept in like a storm, their presence overwhelming. At their head stood Varol, the same Lord General who had been manipulated earlier by Auric's quiet advice. His eyes locked onto Kaelin with a predatory gleam. "We are here, humans," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "We are here because you have something of value. But make no mistake, we do not ally easily. Betray us, and the wrath of House Zar'Kun will break your fragile human necks." Kaelin did not flinch. She smiled. I don't expect anything less from you, Varul. Your strength has always been undeniable. Hours later, the agreement was formalized. The pact was struck. The factions had agreed, in principle, to join forces under the banner of a new council. The subtle maneuvering, the years of covert operations, the quiet planting of influence had culminated in this single moment. The Zar'Kun Empire, long unchallenged at its core, was now poised on the edge of a fundamental shift. Alya stepped away from the table, her mind already running through the next series of steps. Now that they had the support they needed, the rest would unfold swiftly. The pieces were in place. The game was nearing its end. Kalen stood alone at the far end of the room, gazing out at the starry expanse of space. The cold light from distant stars glinted off her golden eye. She had gotten them this far, but now the true test would begin. The throne is no longer a dream, she murmured to herself. It's a whisper, a movement, a promise. Alya approached quietly, her voice softer now, as though they were the only two people in the universe. Now, we begin the hardest part. Kalen nodded slowly. Now, we take the Empire without firing a single shot. The halls of the Imperial Palace on Isharakel were silent. Silent, but not peaceful. The Zar'Kun Empire was vast. Its reach stretched across 1,000 worlds, spanning galaxies in its brutal grasp. Its emperor, Rakathanel, was a symbol of invincibility. For centuries, he had held the sovereignty together with an iron fist, unchallenged and untouchable. Even the most dangerous of enemies were merely pawns in his game. His throne, perched high atop the Palace of Eternity, was the seat of absolute power. But today, the Emperor was dead. The news arrived in the early hours of the morning. A single, coded message shot through the secure communications relay. It wasn't a headline. It wasn't an announcement. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a whisper. Rakathanel, deceased. Status confirmed. For a moment, the Bureau's command center sat still. The collective breath of every agent in the room hung in the air, suspended, as if reality itself were waiting for confirmation. It was Alya who broke the silence, her hands moving instinctively across the control panels. "How?" she whispered. Alric's voice followed her words in a low murmur. "Poison, administered by his personal physician. A slow dose over months. The final injection came last night. The doctor's dead now, of course. Executed in the usual manner." Alya exhaled. "We were ready for this. Of course. But we didn't plan it to be this fast. It was supposed to be a more gradual destabilization. This is a game changer." Kalen entered the command center at that moment, her face pale but unreadable. Her golden cybernetic eye flickered with a brief pulse of light as she processed the information. Without a word, she strode to the central console. "We'll handle this," she said, her voice steady, though the weight of what she was about to command seemed to pull at her. "But we need to move quickly." Alric met her gaze. "Everything is in place. The council is ready. The factions—" "No," Kalen interrupted, her voice low. "The factions will remain neutral for now. The Zekril are already suspicious. We cannot afford to move too quickly. We need to let them think this is their decision." Alya glanced at Kalen, understanding. This was more than a power grab. It was a transformation, one they could not rush. "So, we delay?" Kalen nodded, but her eyes were sharp. "Not delay. We shift. We take advantage of the chaos. But we must control it. The succession is everything now. We need a regent, someone who can claim the throne without a full-scale war." Alya's mind raced. "You mean a human?" Kalen's gaze flickered with a brief flash of something unreadable, then hardened. "Yes, we need a human, someone with no direct bloodline claim, someone they can't challenge." Alric grinned, a dangerous glint in his eye. "I know just the person." Across the planet, the Imperial news networks broadcast the death of Emperor Rakathanel. At first, there was disbelief. The Zar'Kun were not prone to internal assassinations. They were too proud, too rigid in their hierarchy to allow something so personal to seep through. But as the news spread, the question quickly became, who would take the throne? The answer came swiftly. The Senate of the Sovereignty, the most powerful governing body after the emperor himself, was convened under the emergency laws of succession. Their goal was simple: find a replacement, secure the empire's stability, and solidify their control over the galaxy's most powerful military. What the Senate didn't know, however, was that the true decision had already been made. Not by them, not by the Zar'Kun, but by humans working from the shadows. In the heart of the Senate chamber, representatives from the great houses and factions of the sovereignty convened. The Grand Marble Hall was silent as the proceedings began. Rakathan had no heir. His only legitimate offspring had died years ago in an off-world skirmish. A vacuum had formed, and the Senate would decide who filled it. "Let us convene and find the solution," said Shrakath of House Valtor. His voice rang out in the grand hall, authoritative, but laced with a nervousness none of the others cared to show. The murmurs grew louder, and a discussion broke out. "You know the law," Lord General Varul said, his sharp voice cutting through the noise. "The emperor's successor must come from a direct bloodline. If no heir is named, then we must. By that logic, we all may as well lay down our weapons and pray for an alien savior," snapped Lady Krelzal of House Drax. "No, we need a strong regent, one who can unify the sovereignty, not bicker over an ancient rule." As the debate raged, one by one, the Senate turned their eyes toward a figure standing at the rear of the chamber, an unassuming face among the sea of powerful beings. Talon III, a human-born regent, had walked into the Senate hall. His arrival had been orchestrated by the Bureau, the perfect pawn, an empty vessel for power. He had no claim to the throne by birth, no right to the position. But he was human, and thus, by their own twisted interpretation of the law, he could be granted the position of regent. And so, with subtlety and careful maneuvering, a simple but strategic suggestion was made. "The emperor is dead." Auric's voice rang out from the Senate floor, as his coded message was relayed through the delegates' secret communication channels. "The law of succession grants us no immediate heir. But I, as a representative of the human delegations, nominate Talon III. He is born of both worlds, a descendant of Earth and a trusted advisor to many factions. He can be the neutral force we need to guide us through the crisis." The room went still. The Zar'Kun delegation, silent but observant, exchanged glances. Varul's 4 eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Impossible," he growled. "Not impossible," came the calm voice of House Caratha's diplomat. "The law is clear. If there is no heir, a regent must be appointed. There is no one more trusted than a human, if the factions are to support the transition." The vote was swift. Within hours, Talon III was appointed as the new regent of the sovereignty. On the observation deck of the Imperial Palace, Kaelin Reese watched the results unfold. Behind her, the Bureau operatives were already preparing their next move. The Zar'Kun Sovereignty had just been rewritten. "Humanity," Kaelin whispered to herself, a sharp smile spreading across her lips, "is now at the center." It had been 3 days since the death of Emperor Rakathan. 3 days of whispered conversations, guarded meetings, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering. The Zar'Kun Empire was teetering on the edge of something none of them had seen coming. A quiet revolution from within. The humans had infiltrated the heart of the sovereignty with a patience that only centuries of oppression could breed. Through manipulation, persuasion, and subtle influence, they had now taken the throne. Not through battle, but through the complex game of diplomacy and strategy that had been set in motion long before Rakathan's sudden death. The Senate Hall was bustling with activity as the new regent, Talon III, ascended to his new position. He was an unassuming figure, a human born on Earth, raised in secrecy, molded by the Bureau's agents to become the perfect puppet for the Empire's new power structure. His eyes were calm, his demeanor neutral, and yet, in his quiet silence, he was the most dangerous figure in the room. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with suspicion. Even the powerful Zar'Kun house, the long-standing enforcers of the Emperor's will, seemed unsure of the shift in power. They sat at the front, their crimson-scaled faces unreadable as they studied Talon III. Talon stood before the Senate, the golden insignia of his new position gleaming on his chest, the weight of his sudden authority threatening to crush him. He had been prepared for this moment, trained for it, but it felt different now that it was real. Now that he had power. Esteemed members of the Senate, Talon's voice rang out, smooth and steady, though beneath the surface a quiet storm raged. We face a new age in the sovereignty, a new beginning for our empire, one that will no longer be ruled by fear or bloodshed, but by unity and understanding. His words were carefully chosen, each syllable designed to ease the unease in the room, to position himself as both a neutral force and a unifying leader. But the reality was that he was a puppet, a figurehead. The true power now resided in the hands of the humans who had helped him reach this point. And while Talon may have been the regent, it was the Bureau's hands that guided the strings. As he spoke, the room was filled with the soft murmur of the other delegates. Some appeared to be nodding along in agreement, while others exchanged skeptical glances. The factions were unsure whether to accept this new order or reject it outright. They had been ruled by the Zar'Kun for millennia, and while they resented the brutal system, many did not yet trust humanity to lead them. Meanwhile, in the shadows, the Bureau was already working to cement their hold on power. Kalen Reese sat in the dimly lit command center of the Bureau, the latest reports flashing across her screens. The sovereignty was still in flux, its future uncertain, but one thing was clear. The coup had been silent, but it was now unstoppable. The factions, though hesitant, were leaning towards supporting the new regent. They had no choice. The Bureau had woven an intricate web of diplomacy, stoking fears, feeding rumors, and planting just enough uncertainty among the leadership to make Talon III seem like the only viable option. If the Zekril or any of the other great houses dared to challenge him, they would find themselves alone, isolated, and vulnerable. Talon III's rise had not been entirely smooth. He had been pushed into the spotlight by the Bureau's careful manipulations. His position was not the result of a natural power shift, but of carefully crafted influence, a network of loyalty and alliances that no one outside the Bureau knew existed. But now, as Kalen reviewed the reports, she could see that the Senate was swaying. The Vreli had expressed quiet support, recognizing the opportunity for a new status quo. The Nixel traders, ever calculating, had sent messages hinting at their willingness to back the new regent as long as their trade routes remained secure. And House Kareth, always cautious and pragmatic, was already making overtures to align with the new power structure. Only House Zekril remained cautious, suspicious even. They had long been the Emperor's enforcers, and their loyalty to the old regime was ingrained in their very bones. But they were not blind. They knew that a shift in power was inevitable, and they could not afford to remain on the outside, especially not now. Kalen's mind turned over the possibilities. The Zekril could become dangerous if they felt threatened. Their pride was their greatest strength, but also their greatest weakness. The Bureau had worked hard to plant seeds of doubt in their leadership to weaken their cohesion. Now it was time to capitalize on that doubt. Back on the Senate floor, Talon III continued his speech, drawing on every ounce of charm and diplomacy he had learned in his years as a Bureau operative. I ask not for your trust, but for your collaboration. Together, we can build a new era for the sovereignty, one that no longer depends on the fear of one ruler, but on the strength of our collective will. The Senate was silent. The delegates were listening intently, their minds turning over the words, weighing the cost of supporting a human regent. Then, a voice rang out from the back of the room. Regent Talon III, I understand the need for unity, said Lord General Varul of House Zekril, his voice a low growl. But I must ask, what assurance do we have that the humans will not simply use this position to further their own agenda? Will they not seek to dominate us, to replace us as the true rulers of the empire? The room held its breath. Varul had never been one to mince words. He was a brutal leader, fiercely protective of his house, and his suspicion was not without merit. He was the first to openly challenge the new regent, and his words threatened to undo all the Bureau's careful work. Talon, 3 remained calm, his eyes steady. House Zar'Kun, he said, your loyalty to the sovereignty is well known. But this is not about domination. This is about leadership, a leadership that will be fair to all factions, not just the strongest. Under my regency, no faction will be left behind. We will all stand together, or we will fall apart. Varul didn't respond immediately. His 4 eyes narrowed in thought. The room was still. The tension was palpable. Kaelin's fingers twitched as she watched the debate unfold. It was happening, the carefully orchestrated drama that would decide the fate of the sovereignty. The factions were being forced to choose. Would they embrace the new order, or would they continue to fight among themselves? The Bureau had worked for years to create this moment, and now it was a delicate dance between control and chaos. The silence in the Senate hall stretched long. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the Vreli representative spoke. We support the regent, he said. A new order is needed. A new beginning. One by one, the others began to follow suit. Then Excel, House Kareth, even the Zar'Kun, though reluctantly. By the end of the day, Talon III's position was secure. The factions had pledged their allegiance, if only out of necessity. But the Bureau knew that once the machine was in motion, it could not be stopped. The regent was now firmly in place. Kaelin stood before the holographic map of the galaxy, her hands clasped behind her back. The empire was fractured, but it was also stronger than ever before. The pieces were in place. Humanity had finally arrived at the heart of the sovereignty. Now the true game could begin. The sovereignty had been rewritten, and humanity was at its core. The cold expanse of space stretched out in every direction, a vast canvas of stars that had long since lost their wonder to the residents of the Zar'Kun Sovereignty. For millennia, the Empire had thrived in a galaxy where fear and power were the twin pillars of rule. The Zar'Kun had dominated. They had conquered, suppressed, and established an order that was unchallenged, until now. A new power had quietly slipped into the heart of that empire. The throne room of the Imperial Palace was a place of cold grandeur. Black stone walls soared upward, the angular spires cutting through the ambient light of the dying sun. It was here, at the heart of the empire, where the whispers of power had once reverberated from Emperor Rakithanael's throne. Now, it was here where the silence of new possibilities resided. Talon III, the newly appointed regent, stood before the raised dais. His posture was straight, his expression one of quiet determination. Beneath his human skin, he could feel the weight of the title he had inherited, not by blood, but by careful design. The Bureau had orchestrated everything, from the carefully timed assassination of Rakithanael to the swift ascent of Talon III through the ranks of power. It had all been part of their plan. A quiet coup, a revolution of influence, not arms. Behind him, a series of holographic displays flickered, projecting the new alliances that had been forged over the past few weeks. Factions that had once been at odds, Vreli, Kareth, Nixel, even the Zar'Kun, now stood united under the banner of a new council. They had pledged their support to Talon III's rule, not because of loyalty, but because it was the only way to ensure their survival. Their mutual fear of the Zar'Kun's overwhelming power had made them willing partners in this delicate game. Kaelin Reese stood off to the side, her golden eyes scanning the room. The Bureau was always watching, always adjusting, and now they had ensured that the entire political structure of the sovereignty was being held together with their unseen hands. How long until we can solidify the support of House Zar'Kun? Talon III asked, his voice low but steady. Kaelin didn't hesitate. Give them a month. They'll be reluctant, but they won't resist indefinitely. The moment they realize that resisting you means isolation, they'll fall into line. Talon III nodded, though he could feel the growing tension in his chest. The Zar'Kun were a powerful force within the sovereignty, their military prowess unmatched. They were critical to the stability of his reign, but their loyalty was not something that could be bought with promises alone. They had long been the enforcers of the old regime, and their pride was not easily bent. "There's no turning back now," Talon 3 murmured. "Once the Zar'Kun pledge their allegiance, we will have complete control." "We already have control," Kaelin corrected him, her voice firm. "You have the throne, Talon 3. The rest is just formality. Now we build the core." The next several weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, subterfuge, and subtle shifts of power. Talon 3 met with representatives from every faction. Some came with smiles, others with concealed suspicion, but all of them with the knowledge that the new order was inevitable. The Bureau had orchestrated the dissolution of the old power structures, and the pieces were falling into place. At the same time, behind closed doors, the Bureau was carefully orchestrating their next move. With Talon 3 firmly in place, the true goal was clear: the dismantling of the Zar'Kun's absolute rule, replacing it with a more inclusive, though no less controlling, system. The empire would remain intact, but it would no longer be ruled by fear alone. The sovereignty would be reshaped, reformed, with humanity at its core. On a remote moon far from the imperial palace, the last remnants of the Zar'Kun war machine had begun to stir. House Zekril's once proud fleet had been put into disarray after Rakithanael's death. They were in turmoil, their leadership divided, and it wasn't long before their most powerful generals began to question their place in the new order. Varul, the warlord who had once pledged his allegiance to Rakithanael, found himself on the wrong side of history. His house had been loyal, but loyalty in the face of inevitable change was a dangerous thing. He had been caught off guard by Talon 3's rise, and now he was one of the last holdouts against the shifting tide. He stood on the bridge of his flagship, staring out at the starry expanse before him. His eyes, cold and calculating, focused on the projections of his fleet, half-ready, scattered, their loyalty wavering. "General," came the voice of his second-in-command, a lowly figure whose presence had once been unnoticed among the grand strategies of House Zar'Kun. "The regent's power grows. The other factions are rallying around him." Varul turned slowly, his 4 eyes narrowing in contemplation. "And yet, I still command the might of this fleet. We can strike, take control before the council solidifies." "No," the second-in-command said carefully. "The fleet is divided. The Zar'Kun house itself is crumbling. We risk losing everything if we oppose the new regime." Varul's claws clenched into fists. "What is loyalty worth now, if not in blood?" "The new regime offers something more than blood, General," the officer replied. "It offers power, shared power. With the humans at the center, there is room for all of us. We may not be the ruling house anymore, but we can still be part of something greater." The warlord's gaze darkened. There was a long silence. Then he spoke. "Very well. We will wait. But we must move quickly. I will not let the Zar'Kun fall into obscurity." Back on Asharakel, the council chamber was filled with the sound of hushed voices. The most powerful figures in the galaxy were now united under one roof, humanity's hands in the strings of the empire. Talon 3 stood before the gathered delegates, his expression poised but distant. Kaelin was by his side, her gaze sharp and calculating. The room was heavy with the weight of history. For centuries, the Zar'Kun had been the rulers of this galaxy, but now, humanity stood at the helm of the greatest empire in existence. As the delegates spoke, debating the next steps in the restructuring of the sovereignty, Alia, Darren, and Auric watched from the back of the room. Their work was far from over. The core of the new empire had been formed, but it was fragile. The human agents who had brought about this revolution were no longer just pawns. They were now the architects of the future. And that future was one where humanity would no longer be seen as expendable, where Earth, long forgotten, would become the heart of the galaxy once more. Kaelin stood in the shadows, her hands clasped behind her back as she watched Talon 3 address the room. The transition had been swift, and yet it felt like a lifetime had passed since the first seeds of rebellion were planted. The Bureau had won, but there was still much to do, much to reshape. The galaxy would change, and humanity would lead it. She allowed herself a small smile. It was only just beginning. And with that, humanity's quiet revolution had succeeded. The sovereignty remained intact, its power structure rewritten. But at its heart, the humans had arrived, not as servants, not as laborers, but as the core of a new order. The empire had been reshaped, and now it would never be the same.